Welcome to AI-103 Practice Exam. Plan and manage Azure AI solutions. This focused set contains 35 original questions for the planning and management domain. Use each question to practice the architecture, security, governance, deployment, and operations decisions you will need on exam day.
Here is how this practice exam works.
First, read the complete scenario and every response. Next, lock in your answer. You will have 3 silent seconds to commit, and you can pause the video whenever you need more thinking time. Then I will reveal the correct response. Finally, I will explain why it works and reinforce the exam pattern. If this practice helps, like the video and subscribe to WebLizard CertLab for the next AI-103 set. Question 1. A regulated application must process inference requests only in the region where its model deployment is created. The workload is steady, and the team requires guaranteed throughput with lower latency variance. The selected model supports the relevant deployment types in the target region, and sufficient capacity is available. Which deployment option best meets the requirements? A. Developer deployment. B. Global standard deployment. C. Data zone standard deployment. D. Regional provisioned deployment. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Regional provisioned deployment. Why this works? A regional deployment keeps inference processing in the deployment region, and a provisioned deployment provides throughput guarantees with lower latency variance. The scenario already confirms model/type/region support and capacity, which are separate deployment time checks. Exam pattern. Choose a deployment option by jointly applying inference processing geography and throughput/latency guarantees. Question 2. A team is selecting a vector search service for a large, unstructured policy corpus. The application requires first-class hybrid search that combines full text and vector results with semantic ranking. Vector updates do not need to become searchable in real time or near real time. Which service should the team choose? A. An existing relational or NoSQL database selected primarily for immediate vector update visibility. B. Azure AI Search. C. Model fine-tuning selected to store and retrieve the policy corpus. D. Azure Managed Redis selected primarily for ultra-low latency in-memory retrieval. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Azure AI Search. Why this works? Azure AI Search fits when the workload can manage a vector index, does not require near real-time vector update visibility, and needs unstructured indexing, first-class hybrid search, and semantic re-ranking. The database and Redis branches address different decisive requirements. Exam pattern. Choose a vector search service from workload update latency and advanced search requirements. Question 3. A deployed Foundry application meets latency and availability targets, but answer quality may have declined between releases. The team needs a repeatable drift signal independent of live request mix. Which control should it use? A. Track only request count, latency, token use, and errors. B. Run scheduled quality and safety evaluation against a stable test dataset and compare releases. C. Create an alert without defining or measuring a quality condition. D. Sample current production traffic and treat changing request mix as a controlled baseline. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Run scheduled quality and safety evaluation against a stable test dataset and compare releases. Why this works? Scheduled evaluation with test datasets supplies a stable drift comparison. Operational metrics, changing production samples, and notifications alone do not. Exam pattern. Choose stable test dataset evaluation. Fabricam has deployed a Microsoft Foundry retrieval augmented support agent. 2 development teams share one top-level Foundry resource, but require separate development and access boundaries. Connected Azure Storage and Azure AI Search resources remain under their own governance boundaries. The solution also uses registered Azure machine learning assets and produces batch-synthesized Azure text-to-speech avatar videos in MP4 format. Fabricam must monitor production quality, drift, and safety, retain appropriate operational traces and lifecycle lineage, and attach signed origin information to applicable avatar videos. The team is also evaluating, only as a temporary prototype, the public preview Visual Microsoft Foundry workflow surface for a human approval step, and must account for its lack of an SLA, the fact that it is not recommended for production workloads, and its scheduled retirement on December 1st, 2026. Question 4. Using the shared scenario, Fabricam wants team isolation without duplicating every parent setting, and wants to avoid an invalid regional deployment. Which 3 architecture actions should the team take? Select 3 answers. A. Place connected storage and Azure AI search inside the Foundry project governance boundary. B. Confirm the target region supports each required model, deployment type, agents feature, and evaluation feature before provisioning. C. Create a separate top-level Foundry resource for each team solely to obtain development isolation. D. Create separate projects on the shared Foundry resource and assign project-specific access controls. E. Assume the required models, deployment types, agents features, and evaluations exist in every Azure region. F. Manage networking, access policies, and compliance separately on each connected Azure resource. Lock in your answer. Correct response B. Confirm the target region supports each required model, deployment type, agents feature, and evaluation feature before provisioning. D. Create separate projects on the shared Foundry resource and assign project-specific access controls. F. Manage networking, access policies, and compliance separately on each connected Azure resource. Why this works. Multiple projects can provide separate access boundaries while sharing parent resource settings. Connected Azure services keep independent governance boundaries, and regional support for the required capabilities must be confirmed before provisioning. Exam pattern. Design multi-team Foundry boundaries while preserving separate connected resource governance and regional capability validation. Question 5. A team is rolling out post-production observability for a deployed Foundry RAG application. Production interactions cannot be sampled for quality evaluation until runtime telemetry is available. The scheduled test dataset drift evaluation depends on the sampled evaluation configuration. Alert rules will reference the quality thresholds and harm conditions produced by those evaluations. Arrange the implementation steps to satisfy these dependencies. Arrange the implementation steps in the required order. A. Enable sampled continuous evaluation of production traffic. B. Establish operational monitoring for the deployed application. C. Configure Azure Monitor alerts for failed quality thresholds or harmful content. D. Schedule quality and safety evaluations with test datasets to detect drift. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Establish operational monitoring for the deployed application. Step 2. Enable sampled continuous evaluation of production traffic. Step 3. Schedule quality and safety evaluations with test datasets to detect drift. Step 4. Configure Azure Monitor alerts for failed quality thresholds or harmful content. Why this works. The stated rollout dependencies require operational monitoring first, sampled continuous evaluation second, scheduled quality and safety evaluation with test datasets for drift third, and Azure Monitor alerts after the evaluated quality or harm conditions are defined. Operational metrics alone are not the documented drift detection mechanism in the evidence. Exam pattern. Sequence a scenario-constrained post-production observability rollout while distinguishing operational metrics, sampled evaluation, scheduled drift evaluation, and alerts. Question 6. An Azure-hosted application must call a Microsoft Foundry resource without storing secrets. Its system-assigned managed identity is enabled, but calls are denied. The identity has no role assignment on the Foundry resource. What should you do next? A. Assign the managed identity the least privilege applicable role on the Foundry resource. B. Create a private endpoint for the Foundry resource. C. Store a Foundry API key in the application's configuration. D. Disable and recreate the system-assigned managed identity. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Assign the managed identity the least privilege applicable role on the Foundry resource. Why this works. Keyless managed identity access requires both an enabled or attached identity and an applicable role assignment on the Foundry resource. Because the identity already exists, the missing step is to assign the least privilege role that supports the required actions. Exam pattern. Diagnose the missing authorization step after enabling a managed identity for keyless Foundry access. Question 7. An operations team manages several Microsoft Foundry agents. Match each operational need to the most appropriate response or information source. Requirements. 1. During short traffic bursts, some client calls are throttled, but later attempts usually succeed. 2. Steady demand repeatedly exhausts the deployment's request and token capacity. 3. Before optimization, the team must rank which configured agents are likely to cost the most next month. 4. A near real-time portal estimate differs from the amount that must be finalized for accounting. Available targets. A. Open the inventory view that projects each agent's cost from its configuration and observed usage pattern. B. Review the deployment's request and token ceilings and evaluate reserved throughput capacity. C. Space repeated attempts with increasing randomized delays. D. Use the centralized billing records and issued invoice as the reconciliation authority. Lock in your answer. Correct response 1. During short traffic bursts, some client calls are throttled, but later attempts usually succeed. Matches space repeated attempts with increasing randomized delays. 2. Steady demand repeatedly exhausts the deployment's request and token capacity. Matches review the deployment's request and token ceilings and evaluate reserved throughput capacity. 3. Before optimization, the team must rank which configured agents are likely to cost the most next month. Matches open the inventory view that projects each agent's cost from its configuration and observed usage pattern. 4. A near real-time portal estimate differs from the amount that must be finalized for accounting. Matches use the centralized billing records and issued invoice as the reconciliation authority. Why this works. Transient throttling calls for exponential backoff with jitter. Sustained high throughput pressure requires checking TPM/RPM limits and can justify provisioned throughput planning. The agent inventory supplies individual monthly estimates, while Microsoft Cost Management and Invoice Charges are the financial reconciliation authority when near real-time estimates differ. Exam pattern. Differentiate transient rate limit handling, sustained capacity planning, per agent estimation, and authoritative cost reconciliation. Question 8. A concierge agent must learn each user's preferences from interactions and reuse that user-specific context in later sessions. The team accepts use of a preview feature under Azure Preview terms. Which integration should the team select? A. Current session short-term conversation context. B. Foundry agent service memory. C. The file search tool for user-provided documents during an interaction. D. A Foundry IQ knowledge base for curated organizational content. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Foundry agent service memory. Why this works. Foundry Agent Service Memory is the documented choice for learned user-specific or agent context that must persist across sessions. In the archive snapshot, Memory and the Memory Store API are preview features subject to Azure Preview terms. Exam pattern. Choose the correct agent context layer for learned user-specific information that must persist across sessions. Question 9. A team creates a new hosted agent version to validate a change. The test must invoke the candidate through the endpoint, but must not leave the candidate serving traffic or retain the temporary version after validation. Which workflow should the team use? A. Create the candidate version, route the endpoint to it permanently, and keep both versions without reviewing routing implications. B. Create and provision the candidate version, route the endpoint to it temporarily, invoke it, restore the previous route, and delete the temporary version. C. Publish the candidate to a stable endpoint, delete the previous version, and then run the validation call. D. Invoke the candidate directly without creating or provisioning a new version, then overwrite the existing version in place. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Create and provision the candidate version, route the endpoint to it temporarily, invoke it, restore the previous route, and delete the temporary version. Why this works. The documented hosted agent validation flow creates and provisions a new version, temporarily routes the endpoint to it, invokes it, restores the previous route, and deletes the temporary version. Leaving the candidate routed persistently is a separate rollout decision that requires intentionally skipping restoration and deletion after reviewing traffic routing implications. Exam pattern. Configure a non-persistent hosted agent candidate version validation workflow without confusing it with publishing or rollout. Question 10. A team must choose a production model for a private workload that accepts both text and image inputs. A model ranks first on a Foundry model leaderboard, but the team has not yet reviewed its input capabilities or evaluated it with representative private data. Which selection approach should the team use? A. Use capability filters and documentation to identify text and image candidates, then choose the highest ranked candidate without testing representative private workload data. B. Use capability filters and model documentation to identify text and image candidates, then evaluate suitable candidates on representative private data before choosing. C. Confirm text and image support, then evaluate candidates only on the workload's text records and use those results to choose the production model. D. Start with the leaderboard shortlist, evaluate those models on representative private data, and select the best result without verifying image input support in documentation. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use capability filters and model documentation to identify text and image candidates. Then evaluate suitable candidates on representative private data before choosing. Why this works. The team should first use documented capabilities and model information to identify candidates that process both text and images. Then evaluate suitable candidates on representative workload data. Foundry model leaderboards in this evidence are public preview, are not recommended for production workloads, and cover a curated set of text-based language models, rather than specialized or other modality models. Catalog presence or leaderboard rank does not transfer suitability and compliance responsibility from the customer. Exam pattern. Evaluate a multimodal production model selection process when a tempting public benchmark does not cover the required modality or private workload proof. Question 11. Several agents must share grounding from a curated organizational corpus. The solution must connect multiple knowledge sources, enforce source permissions during retrieval, and return citations. The team will verify the required API version and accepts a mixed generally available and preview lifecycle, including preview-only portal access to the complete agentic retrieval feature set in the archived snapshot. Which integration should the team select? A. Foundry Agent Service Memory for learned user-specific context. B. current session short-term conversation context. C, a Foundry IQ knowledge base. D, the file search tool for documents supplied during one interaction. Lock in your answer.
Correct response, C, a Foundry IQ knowledge base. Why this works. A Foundry IQ knowledge base is the documented choice for curated organizational content and can provide a multi-source knowledge base shared by multiple agents, permission-aware agentic retrieval, grounded answers, and citations. Its lifecycle is mixed. Some features are generally available, others are preview, and portal access to all agentic retrieval features is preview only in the archive snapshot. Exam pattern. Choose an agent knowledge integration for shared curated organizational content with permission-aware retrieval and citations.
Question 12. A production support application uses Azure AI Search. Each query can contain an exact equipment code and a natural language description that may use different words from the indexed repair notes. The organization requires generally available features only and wants one search request per user query. Which retrieval design should you choose? A. Use Azure AI Search agentic retrieval, so an LLM decomposes every query into subqueries before searching. B. Use vector search only, so equipment codes are treated as conceptual similarities instead of exact identifiers. C. Use classic hybrid search, so full text and vector queries run in parallel in one request, and the results are merged with reciprocal rank fusion. D. Use keyword search only, so exact equipment codes and conceptual paraphrases are handled by the same lexical match. Lock in your answer.
Correct response, C. Use classic hybrid search, so full text and vector queries run in parallel in one request, and the results are merged with reciprocal rank fusion. Why this works. Classic hybrid search satisfies both parts of the query in one request. Full text search provides exact match precision, vector search provides conceptual similarity, and reciprocal rank fusion merges the result sets. Agentic retrieval adds preview multi-query planning, which conflicts with the GA-only requirement in the archive guidance. Exam pattern. Select a GA retrieval pattern for a mixed exact identifier and conceptual similarity query under a one request constraint. Question 13. A Foundry agent uses a remote MCP server that exposes lookup record, delete record, and several unrelated administration tools. The agent will be published. It must access only lookup record and delete record, require a developer to approve delete record calls, and retain only the downstream permissions needed by the published agent. Which design meets the requirements? A. Allow list every MCP tool. Require approval only for lookup record, and assume publishing copies the shared project identity roles. B. Allow list lookup record and delete record. Require approval for delete record, review its arguments before approval, and assign the required downstream RBAC roles to the published agent's distinct identity. C. Apply an agent content guardrail to the MCP tool call and use that classification result as the downstream resource authorization decision. D. Omit allowed tools, set approval to never, and rely on the shared project identity roles after the agent is published. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Allow list lookup record and delete record, require approval for delete record, review its arguments before approval, and assign the required downstream RBAC roles to the published agent's distinct identity. Why this works. The MCP allow list, approval policy, and downstream authorization are separate controls. Allowed tools limits exposure to the two named tools. The approval policy can target delete record. High-risk arguments should be reviewed, and publishing creates a distinct agent identity whose required downstream RBAC assignments must be made again. Exam pattern. Compose least exposure, per tool approval, and post-publication authorization controls for a remote MCP integration. Question 14. A team is implementing a custom RAG application in Microsoft Foundry over private documents. Arrange the implementation activities in the documented workflow order. Move all 5 steps into the correct order. A. Test retrieval quality and verify that responses are accurate and properly cited. B. Create an index or configure another retrieval service for the content. C. Connect the Foundry project to the index or retrieval service. D. Organize and chunk the private documents into searchable content. E. Integrate retrieval with LLM calls by using the Foundry SDK or REST APIs. Lock in your answer. Correct response, step 1, organize and chunk the private documents into searchable content. Step 2, create an index or configure another retrieval service for the content. Step 3, connect the Foundry project to the index or retrieval service. Step 4, integrate retrieval with LLM calls by using the Foundry SDK or REST APIs. Step 5, test retrieval quality and verify the responses are accurate and properly cited. Why this works. The documented Foundry RAG workflow prepares searchable content, sets up an index or retrieval service, connects it to the Foundry project, integrates retrieval with LLM calls, and then tests retrieval quality and response accuracy and citations. Exam pattern. Order the implementation dependencies for a custom Foundry RAG application. Fabricam has deployed a Microsoft Foundry Retrieval Augmented Support Agent. 2 development teams share one top-level Foundry resource, but require separate development and access boundaries. Connected Azure Storage and Azure AI Search resources remain under their own governance boundaries. The solution also uses registered Azure machine learning assets and produces batch-synthesized Azure text-to-speech avatar videos in MP4 format. Fabricam must monitor production quality, drift, and safety, retain appropriate operational traces and lifecycle lineage, and attach signed origin information to applicable avatar videos. The team is also evaluating, only as a temporary prototype, the public preview visual Microsoft Foundry workflow surface for a human approval step, and must account for its lack of an SLA, the fact that it is not recommended for production workloads, and its scheduled retirement on December 1st, 2026. Question 15. Using the shared scenario, match each audit or governance requirement to the evidence mechanism whose documented scope fits it. Requirements. 1. Retain prompts, model inputs and outputs, tool calls, intermediate steps, latency, token usage, and errors for agent operations. 2. Track version data, training code and compute snapshots, job history, and model registration metadata. 3. Attach cryptographically signed origin information to each applicable batch-synthesized MP4 avatar video. 4. Prototype a wait for human approval step with immutable versions on each save, while retaining the documented preview and retirement caveats. Available targets. A. Azure Text-to-Speech Avatar, C2, PA Content-Credentials Manifest. B. One universal Foundry provenance record for every asset and output. C. Azure Machine Learning Lifecycle Metadata. D. Public preview visual Microsoft Foundry workflow, human in the loop, and version history. E. Microsoft Foundry traces stored in connected application insights. Lock in your answer. Correct response 1. Retain prompts, model inputs and outputs, tool calls, intermediate steps, latency, token usage, and errors for agent operations. Matches Microsoft Foundry traces stored in connected application insights. 2. Track versioned data, training code and compute snapshots, job history, and model registration metadata. Matches Azure Machine Learning Lifecycle metadata. 3. Attach cryptographically signed origin information to each applicable batch-synthesized MP4 avatar video. matches Azure Text-to-Speech Avatar C2 PA Content Credentials Manifest. 4. Prototype a wait for human approval step with immutable versions on each save, while retaining the documented preview and retirement caveats. Matches public preview visual Microsoft Foundry workflow, human in the loop, and version history. Why this works. Foundry traces are operational observability telemetry in application insights. Azure Machine Learning Metadata provides machine learning asset lineage. Avatar C2PA manifests provide signed origin information only for batch-synthesized MP4 avatar video. And the Visual Foundry workflow can wait for human input and preserve save versions only within its public preview, retiring surface. These records are not interchangeable. Exam pattern. Select audit evidence by product local artifact scope instead of treating telemetry, ML lineage, media provenance, and approval state as interchangeable. Question 16. A GitHub Actions pipeline deploys a Foundry-hosted agent with Azure Developer CLI and then invokes it. The test step uses set-EUO pipefail and fails if the captured response file is empty. A deployment returns a non-empty but factually wrong answer, and the pipeline reports that the smoke test passed. What should the team conclude and change? A. Treat the passing smoke test as proof that deployment, liveness, and semantic correctness all passed. B. Replace the response file check with a hosted agent status display because status alone validates answer quality. C. Remove set-EUO pipefail because command failures are the reason a non-empty wrong response is accepted. D. Treat the existing check as liveness only and add a separate workload-specific semantic validation gate for response correctness. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Treat the existing check as liveness only and add a separate workload-specific semantic validation gate for response correctness. Why this works. The template's explicit content assertion checks only that the response file is non-empty. Set-EUO pipefail can also stop the step on an earlier command failure, but neither behavior proves that a non-empty answer is semantically correct. Correctness, therefore, needs a separate workload-specific validation gate. Exam pattern. Diagnose why a deployed hosted agent can pass the documented smoke test while returning an incorrect answer. Question 17. A production application wraps a Foundry-hosted agent with custom routing code. Operators must reconstruct agent and tool execution, diagnose failures in the custom wrapper, and prevent secrets or unnecessary personal data from being retained in telemetry. Which 3 actions should the team take? Select 3 answers. A. Add Azure Text-to-Speech Avatar content credentials to every agent response as the universal trace record. B. Redact or minimize sensitive telemetry, keep secrets out of span attributes, and apply access and retention controls. C. Use the Visual Foundry workflow version history as the production store for hosted agent trace events. D. Add client-side instrumentation for the custom routing code around the agent call. E. Connect application insights and start with Foundry server-side tracing for the hosted agent. F. Use Azure Machine Learning Asset metadata as a complete record of every runtime tool call in the hosted agent. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Redact or minimize sensitive telemetry, keep secrets out of span attributes, and apply access and retention controls. D. Add client-side instrumentation for the custom routing code around the agent call. E. Connect application insights and start with Foundry server-side tracing for the hosted agent. Why this works. For a hosted agent, the archived guidance recommends server-side tracing after application insights is connected. Client-side instrumentation adds visibility into custom application logic. Because traces can contain prompts, outputs, tool arguments, and tool results, the team must minimize or redact sensitive content and govern access and retention. Exam pattern. Design layered runtime auditing for a hosted agent plus custom wrapper while controlling telemetry sensitivity. Question 18. A Foundry agent service agent calls an external tool. The tool request itself is safe, but the returned text can contain harmful content that must be detected before the agent uses it. The team accepts the documented preview lifecycle for agent guardrails. Which intervention point should the guardrail control scan? A. User input. B. Tool response. C. Tool call. D. Model output only. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Tool response. Why this works. The risky content is returned from the tool to the agent, so the tool response intervention point is the applicable control location. Agent guardrails and the agent-only tool call and tool response intervention points are preview in the archive source. Exam pattern. Choose the agent loop intervention point for harmful content arriving from an external tool. You are halfway through the practice exam. Reset your attention. Keep architecture choices separate from runtime controls, and verify the exact mechanism each requirement needs. Question 19. An Azure AI search indexer run reports success, but users cannot retrieve several expected documents. The indexer is configured to tolerate some failed items, and the run contains warnings. Which action provides the most direct ingestion quality evidence for diagnosis? A. Review average search latency because it identifies which source documents failed ingestion. B. Use the top-level indexer status of running as proof that the latest invocation is active and complete. C. Ignore the warnings because a warning cannot indicate an unexpected ingestion outcome when the run status is success. D. Inspect the latest invocation's execution details for document-specific errors, warnings, failed counts, and document keys when available. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Inspect the latest invocation's execution details for document-specific errors, warnings, failed counts, and document keys when available. Why this works. Success can coexist with individual document failures when the error count remains below max failed items. Execution details expose run errors, warnings, and document-specific problems. Failed document keys can appear when available. Warnings do not stop indexing, but can still signal unexpected outcomes. Exam pattern. Diagnose missing index documents when threshold-tolerated failures coexist with a successful run and warnings. Question 20. A team is designing a Microsoft Foundry RAG evaluation plan. Match each measurement requirement to the evaluator whose documented purpose best fits it. Requirements. 1. Measure how effectively the system retrieves relevant information. 2. Measure retrieval result accuracy when ground truth results are available. 3. Score from 1 to 5 how well the response is supported by retrieved context using model-based judgment. 4. Measure how relevant the response is to the user's query. Available targets. A. Groundedness. B. Document retrieval. C. Groundedness Pro Preview. Binary pass/fail, using Azure AI content safety without a model deployment. D. Retrieval. E. Relevance. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. Measure how effectively the system retrieves relevant information. Matches retrieval. 2. Measure retrieval result accuracy when ground truth results are available. Matches document retrieval. 3. Score from 1 to 5 how well the response is supported by retrieved context using model-based judgment. Matches groundedness. 4. Measure how relevant the response is to the user's query. Matches relevance. Why this works. The RAG Evaluator catalog separates retrieval effectiveness, retrieval accuracy against ground truth, groundedness in retrieved context, and response relevance. Groundedness Pro is a different preview entry with a binary content safety-based result and is not the requested 1 to 5 model-based groundedness measure. Exam pattern. Map closely related RAG measurement goals to distinct evaluator purposes and outputs. Question 21. A team is narrowing model family candidates from the current archived Microsoft guidance. Workload A must process both text and images. Workload B needs a small language model documented for low latency operation with fewer resource reasoning options. Which two candidates align with those requirements? Availability, region, deployment mode, and workload evaluation will be checked separately. Select two answers. A. GPT-5 family for workload B solely because it targets complex multi-step tasks requiring high accuracy. B. GPT-4o or GPT-4o mini for workload A. C. A Foundry action tool for workload A because tools are a multimodal model class. D. 5.4 family for workload B. E. Any text leaderboard leader for workload A without checking image input capability. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. GPT-4o or GPT-4o mini for workload A. D. 5.4 family for workload B. Why this works. The archived model family guidance identifies GPT-4o and GPT-4o mini as multimodal models that process text and images. It identifies 5.4 as a small language model that excels in low latency scenarios, and the 5.4 reasoning variants as multi-step options requiring fewer resources. These characteristics narrow candidates, but do not replace deployment time availability checks or representative workload evaluation. Exam pattern. Narrow two model family candidates from explicit modality and latency/resource constraints without collapsing tools into model classes. Question 22. A repository contains a hosted agent project created with AZD init. The Foundry project and hosted agent were already provisioned and deployed manually. The team now wants a GitHub Actions pipeline for code deployment without storing a long-lived Azure client secret. Which preparation is required for the documented pipeline? A. Remove the existing cloud resources so the first pipeline run can use the deployment workflow as the initial provisioning step. B. Configure GitHub OIDC federation, grant the workflow identity the mode-appropriate project roles, and store the required non-secret configuration as repository variables. C. Store a client secret in repository variables and omit the federated credential because AZD performs deployment. D. Grant only a top-level resource management role because it automatically covers every project data plane action. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Configure GitHub OIDC federation, grant the workflow identity the mode-appropriate project roles, and store the required non-secret configuration as repository variables. Why this works. The archived GitHub Actions Quick Start requires an AZD initialized repository and an already provisioned Foundry project and hosted agent. It uses OIDC federation rather than a long-lived client secret, requires deployment mode appropriate roles for the workflow identity, and stores non-secret configuration in repository variables. Control plane and data plane permissions remain distinct. Exam pattern. Prepare identity, permissions, and variables for an existing hosted agent project's GitHub Actions deployment pipeline. Question 23. A team operates an Azure AI search index that grounds a Microsoft Foundry RAG application. Match each operational situation to the most direct evidence or mechanism. Requirements. 1. The service reports that an indexer is configured and available. Determine whether its latest scheduled attempt is currently in progress. 2. A run finished within its max failed items tolerance, but some source records are absent from the index. Obtain identifiers for the skipped records before backfilling them. 3. Page the on-call team when the mean response time for search requests exceeds the team's service objective. 4. During RAG quality review, score whether each generated answer addresses what the user asked, rather than whether the retrieve set matches ground truth. Available targets. A. Indexer execution status with failed document details and keys when available. B. The relevance evaluator for the Foundry RAG application. C. An Azure AI search metric alert for average search latency. D. The per invocation run status in get indexer status. Lock in your answer. Correct response: 1. The service reports that an indexer is configured and available. Determine whether its latest scheduled attempt is currently in progress. Matches: the per invocation run status in get indexer status. 2. A run finished within its max failed items tolerance, but some source records are absent from the index. Obtain identifiers for the skipped records before backfilling them. Matches: indexer execution status with failed document details and keys when available. 3. Page the on-call team when the mean response time for search requests exceeds the team's service objective. Matches: an Azure AI search metric alert for average search latency. 4. During RAG quality review, score whether each generated answer addresses what the user asked, rather than whether the retrieved set matches ground truth. Matches: the relevance evaluator for the Foundry RAG application. Why this works: invocation status, document level execution details, platform metric alerts, and application evaluators answer different operational questions. The top-level indexer status does not prove an invocation is active, and operational latency is not a relevant score. Exam pattern: map for monitoring needs to the correct operational or semantic evidence layer. Question 24. A team is preparing a Microsoft Foundry RAG application for a release decision. The evaluation must cover retrieval effectiveness, whether the answer is supported by retrieved context, answer relevance to the query, and content safety. A. Run only the relevance evaluator and treat its score as the complete assessment. B. Use only Azure AI Search latency and throttling metrics for the release decision. C. Run retrieval, groundedness, relevance, and content safety evaluators. D. Use the Azure Machine Learning Responsible AI dashboard to explain each generated answer. Lock in your answer. Correct response: C. Run retrieval, groundedness, relevance, and content safety evaluators. Why this works: Foundry documents application-specific evaluator combinations. For RAG, retrieval, groundedness, relevance, and content safety cover distinct quality and safety questions. One score or service health telemetry does not replace the combination. Exam pattern: choose a comprehensive evaluator set for a RAG release assessment. Question 25. An architecture team is standardizing new Microsoft Foundry agent deployments. Some agents are completely defined by instructions, a model, and tools. Other agents require custom orchestration code. The standard must also prevent deployment into an unsupported region. Select 3 statements that should be included in the standard. A. Use a hosted agent when custom code must run behind a Foundry-managed endpoint with auto-scaling. B. Use a prompt agent when configuration fully defines the agent and no runtime application code must be maintained. C. Use Azure AI Inference as the current default package for new model inference code. D. Treat the hosted agent CI/CD template as first-time provisioning for the Foundry project and initial agent. E. Verify that the resource region supports both the responses API and agent service before deployment. F. Budget prompt and hosted agents as having the same maintained code and container compute boundary. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Use a hosted agent when custom code must run behind a Foundry-managed endpoint with autoscaling. B. Use a prompt agent when configuration fully defines the agent and no runtime application code must be maintained. E. Verify that the resource region supports both the responses API and agent service before deployment. Why this works. Prompt agents and hosted agents have different configuration, code, compute, identity, and cost boundaries. New deployments also require explicit region support checks for responses API and agent service. Exam pattern. Select the correct agent mode for configuration only versus custom code needs and apply current deployment readiness checks. Question 26. A regulated organization is designing Microsoft Foundry for 2 development teams. All agent customer data must remain in organization-owned Azure resources and be isolated by project. Both teams may reuse centrally approved model deployments, while connected storage, Key Vault, and Azure AI Search must retain independent network and access governance. Regional support is not yet confirmed. Which foundation design satisfies the requirements? A. Provision in any region and verify features later. Use standard agent setup but store both projects in one shared customer data partition. Centralize connected resource policies inside Foundry, and omit project scope evaluation and agent metrics. B. Create the projects before checking regional support. Use basic agent setup for customer-owned storage. Inherit storage, Key Vault, and search policies from the Foundry resource, and rely only on resource-level metrics for both teams. C. Confirm required regional capabilities first. Create one governed Foundry resource with separate projects. Use standard agent setup with customer-provided resources. Govern each connected Azure resource separately. Monitor both resource-level and project-level signals, and route diagnostic logs as needed. D. Use each project as the top-level Azure governance resource. Place connected storage, Key Vault, and search inside the project boundary. Use Microsoft-managed multi-tenant state, and share one project data partition across both teams. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Confirm required regional capabilities first. Create one governed Foundry resource with separate projects. Use standard agent setup with customer-provided resources. Govern each connected Azure resource separately. Monitor both resource-level and project-level signals, and route diagnostic logs as needed. Why this works. Foundry capabilities differ by region, so the region must support the required models and features before provisioning. A Foundry resource is the top-level governance boundary, and projects are development boundaries that can reuse resource-level deployments and connections. Standard agent setup places customer data in customer-provided Azure resources and isolates it by project. Connected storage, Key Vault, and search remain independently governed, and observability distinguishes resource and project scopes. Exam pattern. Select a coherent, regulated Foundry foundation across region, hierarchy, customer data custody, connected resource governance, and monitoring scope. Question 27. An Azure-hosted service must call Microsoft Foundry Agent Service without stored secrets. Its requests are denied. Review the deployment configuration. Visible artifact. The caller has a managed identity of the system-assigned type. Its state is enabled. The Foundry resource has no role assignments. A. Replace the managed identity with a static Foundry resource API key. B. Enable the same system-assigned identity again without adding a role assignment. C. Create a Foundry private endpoint and leave the role assignment list empty. D. Assign the caller identity the narrowest applicable Foundry role on the Foundry resource. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Assign the caller identity the narrowest applicable Foundry role on the Foundry resource. Why this works. Managed identity access has two parts. Enable or attach the identity, then assign it an applicable role on the Foundry resource. The configuration already enables the identity but grants no role. Exam pattern. Diagnose a keyless managed identity configuration that enables identity but omits authorization. Question 28. A Microsoft Foundry application must interpret a user-submitted product photo together with a text question. The team also has representative private workload data for validation. A. Select any model in the catalog because catalog presence establishes multimodal suitability and compliance. B. Narrow to GPT-4o or GPT-4o Mini for text and image input, then evaluate candidates on the private workload data. C. Select a Foundry tool as the multimodal model because tools and model families are interchangeable. D. Select the highest ranked text model on the public leaderboard and treat that ranking as final workload proof. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Narrow to GPT-4o or GPT-4o Mini for text and image input. Then evaluate candidates on the private workload data. Why this works. The required input modalities narrow the choice to a model documented to process text and images, such as GPT-4o or GPT-4o Mini. Workload-specific evaluation is still required, and the public leaderboard is scoped to curated text-based models. Exam pattern. Select a model family by required input modality and preserve workload-specific validation. Question 29. A team is migrating an Azure AI Search agentic retrieval workload to a production policy that allows only stable REST API features. The workload uses one existing search index as its knowledge source. It needs extractive grounding content together with activity and references, and the application will perform answer synthesis. It does not need a running messages transcript or low or medium retrieval reasoning effort. A. Target API version equals 2026-04-01, but keep messages. Retrieval reasoning effort equals low and output mode, so the service synthesizes the answer. B. Recreate the search index knowledge source and knowledge base for API version equals 2026-04-01. Submit semantic intents and have the application synthesize answers from the extractive response. C. Replace agentic retrieval with classic RAG because all agentic retrieval knowledge sources and retrieve operations remain preview only. D. Move to API version equals 2026-05-01 preview so the service can preserve low reasoning effort, multi-turn messages, and built-in answer synthesis. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Recreate the search index knowledge source and knowledge base for API version equals 2026-04-01. Submit semantic intents and have the application synthesize answers from the extractive response. Why this works. The 2026-04-01 REST API is the first stable agentic retrieval API. Its minimal contract supports search index knowledge sources and returns extractive grounding content with activity and references. Migration requires new knowledge source and knowledge base objects and uses intents rather than messages. The stable contract removes retrieval reasoning effort, output mode, and service-side answer synthesis, so the application must synthesize the final answer. The 2026-05-01 preview capabilities and portal-only access to all agentic retrieval features do not satisfy a stable-only policy. Exam pattern. Choose a stable agentic retrieval migration that preserves required grounding evidence while moving answer synthesis to the application. Question 30. A Foundry private endpoint is in the same region and subscription as its virtual network. Public network access is disabled. The endpoint connection state is pending, and custom DNS resolves the Foundry FQDN to a public IP. Applications in the virtual network use the existing Foundry connection string and cannot connect. A. Create a new private-only connection string and leave the endpoint state and DNS unchanged. B. Leave the endpoint pending and change only custom DNS to the private endpoint IP. C. Approve the private endpoint, but keep the Foundry FQDN resolving to its public IP. D. Approve the private endpoint and configure custom DNS so the same Foundry FQDN resolves to its private endpoint IP. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Approve the private endpoint and configure custom DNS so the same Foundry FQDN resolves to its private endpoint IP. Why this works? Only an approved private endpoint can carry traffic to the private link resource, and clients in the virtual network must resolve the existing Foundry endpoint FQDN to the private endpoint IP. The connection string itself does not change. Exam pattern. Diagnose simultaneous private endpoint approval and DNS failures while preserving disabled public access. Question 31. A call center must transcribe a high volume of recorded conversations. The service must support advanced customization, speaker diarization, and a custom vocabulary. The team will verify current regional availability before deployment. A. Use Foundry models for flexible text generation and omit a speech-specific service. B. Use Azure Speech in Foundry tools as the dedicated speech service. C. Use general Azure OpenAI audio, because dedicated speech capabilities are unnecessary. D. Use Azure Content Understanding, because the output is schema-defined document data. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use Azure Speech in Foundry tools as the dedicated speech service. Why this works? High-volume speech transcription that requires advanced customization, speaker diarization, or custom vocabulary is directed to the dedicated Azure Speech service rather than general Azure OpenAI audio. Exam pattern. Choose a specialist service from workload requirements rather than defaulting to a broad multimodal model. Question 32. A remote MCP server exposes lookup product, update price, and delete product. A Foundry agent must be able to call only lookup product. The team does not want the other tools exposed to the agent at all. A. Omit allowed tools because omission denies access to every server tool. B. Set allowed tools to include only lookup product. C. Set require approval to never and expose all three tools. D. Set require approval to always and expose all three tools. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Set allowed tools to include only lookup product. Why this works? For a remote MCP tool, allowed tools restricts which server tools the agent can access. Omitting it includes every tool exposed by the server. Approval policy governs approval behavior, not whether unwanted tools are exposed. Exam pattern. Select the MCP control that limits the agent visible toolset. Question 33. A team assigns one guardrail to a core model and to an agent developed in Foundry Agent Service. The guardrail contains an agent tool call control and a content risk control whose preview risk is not yet supported for agents. The team is documenting the behavior represented by the archived 2026-0725 evidence snapshot. Which two statements should the team include? Select two answers. A. Verify target support because agent-specific controls do not run on models, and an unsupported preview risk does not take effect on the agent. B. Assume the guardrail also covers prompts and completions processed by audio models such as Whisper. C. Expect every control in the shared guardrail to run identically on both the core model and the agent. D. Set every content risk control to off without requesting approval for modified guardrails. E. Treat the agent guardrail and the agent-only tool call intervention point as preview capabilities. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Verify target support because agent-specific controls do not run on models, and an unsupported preview risk does not take effect on the agent. E. Treat the agent guardrail and the agent-only tool call intervention point as preview capabilities. Why this works. Agent guardrails and agent-only tool call and tool response intervention points are preview in the snapshot. Control execution depends on the target. Agent-specific controls do not run on models, and preview risks not supported for agents do not take effect on an agent merely because they are configured. Exam pattern. Determine which configured guardrail controls can execute across a core model and a Foundry Agent Service agent. Question 34. A customer-facing chat application sends individual inference requests and must return each response synchronously. Traffic is variable and bursty. The organization has no data residency restrictions, accepts latency variance, and wants pay-per-token billing instead of reserved capacity. The workload cannot be queued for asynchronous batch processing. Which deployment type should the architect choose? A. Developer. B. Global batch. C. Global standard. D. Global provisioned. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Global standard. Why this works. Global standard fits the intersection of the stated criteria, no residency restriction, variable bursty traffic, pay-per-token billing, and acceptable latency variance. Exam pattern. Select global standard for synchronous online, variable bursty, pay-per-token inference with no residency restriction and acceptable latency variance. Question 35. A generally available Foundry Agent Service application has two independent failures. Short traffic spikes produce model deployment 429 responses, and a workflow also exceeds a documented agent service file limit. Which two actions address the failures within the documented service boundaries? Select two answers. A. Redesign the workflow to operate within the fixed agent service file limit. B. Treat both failures as tenant-level quota exhaustion and move the agent to another tenant. C. Configure a warm pool and replica count to absorb both failures. D. Implement exponential backoff with jitter for the transient 429 responses. E. Submit a model quota request to increase the agent service file limit. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Redesign the workflow to operate within the fixed agent service file limit. D. Implement exponential backoff with jitter for the transient 429 responses. Why this works. Model deployment rate limits and agent service artifact limits are separate enforcement layers. Transient 429 responses call for exponential backoff with jitter, while the listed file, message, and tool limits are fixed and require application design within those constraints. Exam pattern. Diagnose two limit failures and choose a different remediation for each enforcement layer. You completed AI-103 practice exam. Plan and manage Azure AI solutions. Review the mechanisms you missed, revisit the official documentation where needed, and use the next set to strengthen your exam-ready judgment. Thank you for practicing with WebLizard's Cert Lab. Continue with AI-103 practice exam, generative AI apps, models, and RAG.